Hello everybody and welcome to the 7th episode of the Cosmic Clinic podcast. I'm Christelle, your host, and before we begin, again I want to say something I always say on this podcast because I genuinely always mean it every single time, and it's something that I truly practice myself before I try and do anything. I'm not perfect at it because sometimes my mind just wants to go. But I just want to let you know that you do not need to take notes while listening to this. You don't need to capture every idea. If anything, I would rather you slow down while you listen and let the conversation land where it lands. Some parts will resonate immediately. Some parts might just make sense later, or some parts might not even apply to you. And that's perfectly fine. Now, today what I want to talk to you about today is something that's been on my mind for a while, but has become even more relevant recently as I've really took the time to refine my own work and the direction I'm taking with astrology. And the phrase I've been using internally is high performance astrology. And if you see some of the posts that I share on TikTok, it's really centered about that. And I want to explain what I mean by that because I can see how it can be easily misunderstood. So when people hear high performance, they sometimes think of hustle culture or productivity culture, and they think about pushing, yourself harder, waking up earlier, doing more, achieving more, and constantly optimizing every part of your life in a very kind of rigid fashion. And to be honest, that was me. And it's still me in some ways, but that's not really what I mean. What I'm trying to get at, or what I'm interested in, is something different in the sense that I'm interested in how we understand the natural wiring of our minds and our nervous system, and then build our lives, our work, our ambitions, our family life, everything that we do on a day-to-day around that wiring, instead of consistently, unknowingly, subconsciously even fighting against it. So because one of the things I've noticed over the years is that both in my own life and in the lives of people I work with, people I know, people who I live with, is that a lot of very intelligent, very capable people feel like they are somehow failing at systems that were just never designed for them. They read books, they follow the productivity advice, they try to implement the routines that successful people talk about, the rituals but just something doesn't always click, but yet they keep pushing forward. And this was also me as well, by the way. And what happens is that they assume, or we assume, that we are the problem, that the problem is within us. We assume that we're not disciplined enough, we're not focused enough, we're not motivated enough, we're not inspired enough. But sometimes the problem is that our minds simply just works differently and requires unique systems and frameworks in order to function in its best optimized way. And I suppose this is where the astrology becomes incredibly interesting for me, because astrology is essentially a symbolic map of tendencies. It literally shows us patterns in how people process information, how they respond to pressure, how they express their energy, and where they naturally direct their attention. And if you combine that with what we now know from neuroscience about cognitive styles and nervous system regulation, you can kind of start seeing something quite powerful emerge, in that you start to see that success does not look the same for everyone. Like, you start to see it, but really understand it physically in your body, that this really is the case. Okay. It's not just this logical reasoning that you have. It's like a real reality. So for instance, some people thrive in fast-paced environments where they can make decisions quickly and move forward without overthinking. This definitely isn't me. Okay, this sounds like a Mercury in kind of Gemini essence type of energy, or Mercury in an air sign. Maybe not so much Libra, but you get the essence. Other people thrive when they have time to analyze, refine, and build systems carefully. This sounds like much more of a Mercury in an earth sign. And some people generate ideas constantly but struggle with execution. And that might be a water sign because they're so easily inspired, but it's watered down by imagination, and so the action element isn't there. Others execute beautifully but need external inspiration. And that could very much be a fire person. And one of the reasons I'm personally fascinated by this is because I am aware, or I'm very aware in fact, that my own mind does not operate in the most conventional way. I'm someone who thinks very deeply about things, sometimes to the point where it can look like overthinking from the outside, because I notice patterns constantly. I'm always analyzing the subtleties and the nuances of how things work, whether that's psychological patterns, behavioral patterns, or even patterns in my own responses to situations. Like, I'm so sensitive to those elements of my environment. And for a long time, I thought that was something I needed to correct. I thought I needed to become less of that and more decisive, more straightforward, more logical. But over time, I realized that the analytical nature of the way my mind worked wasn't the problem. It's actually one of my greatest strengths. The real question is not how do I stop thinking this way? The real question is actually, how do I design my work and my life in a way that allows that way of thinking to be useful rather than overwhelming? And this is what I mean by high performance astrology. It's not about using astrology to predict events. It's about using astrology to understand the architecture of your mind. For example, when you look at a birth chart, Mercury tells us something about how a person processes information. It tells us how someone thinks, how we communicate, how we organize ideas. And Mars tells us something about how a person initiates action. For example, how do we move quickly? Or do we move quickly even? Do we move carefully? Do we need momentum, or do we need strategy in order to take action? And Saturn tells us how someone handles pressure and responsibility. So some of us respond to pressure by becoming more focused, and some of us become paralyzed by the pressure. When you begin to see these dynamics together, you start to understand why two people can have the same goal, but approach it in completely different ways, and also still become successful in whatever that, their action was, or their intentions were. So this becomes particularly important for entrepreneurs and creators, because entrepreneurship is essentially the process of building something out of uncertainty. There is no fixed path. There is no guaranteed structure, and every little external validation, there is very little external validation in the early stages of launching anything. So your ability to succeed in that environment depends not only in your ideas or your skills, but also in how your nervous system handles ambiguity. Some people find ambiguity stimulating. Others find it extremely stressful. And I would say I'll probably fall in between the two. So astrology can help us identify those tendencies, but it's not deterministic. It doesn't say you must behave in a certain way. What it does highlight, though, is where you might need to develop certain capacities or create certain support systems. For example, someone with a strong Saturn influence in their chart might have a natural ability to work steadily over long periods of time. They might be comfortable with delayed gratification, but they might also struggle with self-criticism or fear of failure. Or take someone with a strong Uranian energy, they might be brilliant at innovation. Uranian energy is so good with that. It's genius with innovation. They might see possibilities that other people do not see, but they might struggle with consistency or routine because they can't do the regular everyday stuff. Everything that Uranian people do has to be random, spontaneous, spark interest, spark inspiration. It has to be sudden. So routine can break that interest for them, or that ability. So when you know these things about yourself, you can design systems that work with your tendencies instead of constantly trying to override them. And this is where neuroscience becomes extremely relevant, because the brain is essentially a prediction machine. It is consistently trying to reduce uncertainty by building models of the world. And when your brain is operating in an environment that aligns with its natural processing style, it tends to feel calmer and more focused. And when it is constantly forced into environments that contradict its natural tendencies, it becomes stressed and dysregulated. So part of building success is not simply pushing harder. It is learning how to work with the way your mind naturally processes information and responds to pressure. I have noticed that many people in my audience are highly sensitive, highly perceptive, often neurodivergent in some way. That might mean, ADHD, dyslexia, heightened sensory awareness, or simply a mind that processes things just very intensely, like, for example, Mercury in Scorpio. Those minds often come with extraordinary strengths. Pattern recognition, creativity, empathy, intuitive insight, that's all so powerful. But they also come with challenges, including overstimulation, overanalysis, difficulty in maintaining focus on tasks that feel meaningless to them. So traditional success advice often ignores these patterns and realities. It assumes that everyone has the same cognitive style, the same capacity for repetitive, structured work, and it just really isn't the case, is it? Come on, let's be real. High performance astrology acknowledges that this is just not true. It asks a different type of question. Instead of asking how you can force yourself into a predetermined model of success, it asks how you can design a model of success that fits your natural wiring. And that process begins with self-awareness. One of the most important things you can do is observe your own patterns and being honest about them. For example, when do you feel most focused? When do you feel most creative? When do you feel most overwhelmed? When do you feel most misaligned with your goals, what's going on in your life that day? Like, what happens? If you look at those patterns through both an astrological and neurological lens, you often begin to see connections that were previously invisible. For example, someone with a very active Mercury might intellectually stimulate to stay engaged. They might need that. They might struggle with tasks that feel repetitive or mechanical. They just need that constant mental stimulation. Or for someone with a strong moon placement, they might be deeply influenced by their emotional environments. Their productivity might fluctuate depending on how safe they feel or how supported they feel. Understanding these tendencies does not mean you become passive. It means you become strategic. Strategic is the operative word here. You start designing your work rhythms, you start designing your goals and your expectations in ways that actually support your natural strengths. And this is where genuine performance begins to emerge, not from forcing yourself to be someone else, but from becoming more fully aligned with the person you already are, from becoming more fully as aligned with your actual astrological blueprint. And as we continue this conversation, I want to explore more deeply how different astrological factors interact with cognitive styles and nervous system responses, and how we can use that knowledge to build lives and careers that are not only successful, but also sustainable. Because sustainability is the part that is often missing from conversations about success. Many people can push themselves for a short period of time, but very few people can maintain that push without eventually burning out. If your success strategy depends on constant stress or constant self-criticism, it will eventually collapse because it's just not sustainable. High performance, in the way I'm using the term, is not about intensity. It's about alignment. Another operative word, alignment. Before we finish, I want to leave you with something to sit with. Rather than asking how you can improve yourself further, I want to ask a slightly different question. Where in your life are you trying to force yourself to operate in a way that simply isn't natural to your mind? And if you step back for a moment and look at your chart, your nervous system, and your natural tendencies with honesty and curiosity, what would change about the way you approach success, work, and growth? Sometimes the real shift is not learning how to push harder. Sometimes the real shift is learning how to design your life around the way your mind actually works. Just sit with that. Reflect on it. And on that note, I want to say thank you for spending this time thinking with me. And I'll speak to you again in the next episode. You take care now. Love, Christelle.